Welcome to the second part of the French Development Agency's Mini-MOOC on financial climate risks. In the previous courses, we focused on the main concepts that allow us to understand the major issues related to financial climate risks. In these 4 new courses, we will decipher the more specific mechanisms through which these risks can affect different types of economic actors. It is important to understand these mechanisms in order to strengthen the resilience of economies and economic actors to climate change and to ensure that everyone is coordinated in a decarbonization pathway. This first course examines the impact of climate risks on country risk and macroeconomic balances of a country. The next courses will address more specifically businesses, financial institutions, and local authorities. Climate risks, whether physical or transitional, can affect the real economy, financial stability, and public finance balances of a state. But how can we assess the interactions between climate risks and the macroeconomic and financial analysis components of country risk and sovereign risk? Within the French Development Agency Country Risk Team, we've developed a methodological framework to assess physical climate risk and its macroeconomic and financial consequences. But first, let's define what country risk is. For a financial institution, country risk is defined as the probability of incurring financial losses on its asset portfolio due to macroeconomic, financial, or political imbalances in a given country. Country risk analysis consists of assessing the growth trajectory of countries as well as the economic, financial, and socio-political vulnerabilities associated with this trajectory. The economic diagnostics cover 5 dimensions: growth, financial system, public finance, external financing, and socio-political risk. Since 2019, we have integrated in our country risk analyses the impact of physical climate risks on the 5 dimensions of country risk. I will now introduce you to the methodology for analyzing physical climate risks developed within the French Development Agency Country Risk Team. This approach is based on the results of a qualitative assessment of the risk based on the combination of exposure to climate hazards and the vulnerability of each country. For our methodology, we have chosen the IPCC definition of physical climate risk. The IPCC defines physical climate risk at a country level as exposure to climate hazards combined with vulnerability. In order to fully understand the IPCC definition, it is important to characterize the different terms to use. Exposure refers to the nature and degree to which a system is prone to significant climatic variations. A climate hazard is a physical event that has the potential to cause economic and social damages. The hazards considered are the following: rising temperatures, the rise in sea levels, the modification of rainfall with, on the one hand, hydric stress, and on the other hand, extreme precipitations. And the 5th, the intensification of extreme phenomena such as the cyclonic risk, for example. Vulnerability, or sensitivity, refers to the extent to which a stakeholder exposed to climate change is likely to be affected, favorably or unfavorably, by the occurrence of a hazard. The approach of our climate physical risk analysis is articulated around 4 steps. The 4 steps are as follows. Step 1 assesses the exposure of countries to climate-related hazards. Step 2 cross-references hazard exposure with sectoral vulnerability. Step 3 assesses the interaction between physical climate risks and country risk components. Finally, Step 4 assesses the resilience and adaptation to climate change of countries. I will now detail more precisely these 4 steps. The example of Vietnam will illustrate the application of the methodology for these 4 steps. Step 1 is to assess the exposure of countries to climate hazards. For this, we rely on indicators and reports provided by external data providers such as 427, the World Bank, and the IMF. Consider the case of Vietnam as an example. Vietnam has a high degree of exposure to several climate hazards. The country is highly exposed to the cyclone hazard. 79 cyclones were recorded between 1980 and 2016, and to sea level rise, with 15% of the most populated lands exposed to flood risk. The country's exposure to extreme precipitation is also high, with an increase in flooding. Heat stress is also expected to increase, with higher annual maximum temperatures and heat waves. Now, on to the second step. Step 2 cross-references sectoral vulnerability to climate change with the country's exposure to hazards. This step leads to the assessment of the physical climate risk level for each economic sector. For this purpose, each economic sector, according to the NAF classification, receives an intrinsic characterization of its vulnerability to climate change according to 4 modalities, based on a set of academic publications. This sectoral categorization is based on potential direct economic impacts. It should be noted that, according to the literature, the agricultural sector seems very exposed to the effects of climate change. In a large number of developing countries, the share of agriculture in the value added is higher than 15%, resulting in a large proportion of the working population being employed in this sector. The economies of these countries, which are heavily agricultural, are likely to be particularly exposed to the effects of climate change. For example, in Vietnam, the agriculture, forestry, and fisheries sectors are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change due to their exposure to cyclones and sea level rise. The manufacturing industry also appears vulnerable to the same hazards. Let's move on to step 3. The third step of the method involves assessing the interactions of physical climate risk with the components of country risk analysis. As presented initially, the 5 components of country risk are growth, public finance, the financial system, the external sector, and the socio-political. This third step consists of characterizing the direct and indirect effects of physical climate risk using a qualitative approach. A series of indicative questions can guide the analyst in the elaboration of the diagnosis. For example, with regard to growth, one may wonder about the share of value added of sectors vulnerable to climate change. Similarly, to assess the impact on public finances, one of the questions will be, do the exposure and vulnerability of certain sectors threaten government budget revenues? In the case of Vietnam, as a reminder, Step 2 characterized the vulnerability of the agricultural and manufacturing sectors to various climate hazards. What could be the macroeconomic consequences in the event of the materialization of climate risk in these 2 sectors? The agricultural sector is vulnerable because cultivable areas are particularly exposed, given that the agricultural sector accounts for 18% of GDP and employs more than 42% of the country's active population. In particular, the Mekong Delta is the country's rice granary and accounts for 55% of national rice production, 70% of fruit production, and 70% of aquaculture products. Rice yields in the Mekong Delta could decrease by 6% to 12% due to flooding and salinity intrusion. Overall, the vulnerability of this sector can weigh on economic growth and lead to a potential socio-political risk if no adaptation policy is implemented. Concerning the manufacturing industry, the vulnerability of this sector is linked to the location of productive assets in flood-prone areas. It remains significant for the growth of the activity, representing 15% of GDP and an important source of foreign exchange through exports of electronics and textiles. In addition, the economic consequences of past cyclones on these sectors of activity have been significant. Over the last 30 years, an average of 500 people per year have died or been reported missing due to natural disasters, while the economic losses are estimated to be around 1.5% of GDP per year. Finally, the Vietnamese banking sector has about 30% exposure to the primary and industrial sectors. Step 4, the final step of the analysis, assesses resilience and adaptation to climate change. Indeed, an analysis of resilience and adaptation to climate change can enrich the assessment of the physical climate risk of a given country. According to the IPCC in its 2001 report, adaptation to climate change can mitigate adverse effects or exploit beneficial opportunities. The existence of public policies for adaptation to climate change and their credibility in terms of financing are analyzed for each country. In Vietnam, the Vietnamese government has placed adaptation to climate change at the heart of its strategy, particularly in the Mekong Delta region, through a national adaptation plan. The French Development Agency has been supporting Vietnam in the fight against climate change for several years. For example, the AFD has co-financed the construction of hydraulic structures in the city of Dien Bien Phu to reduce riverbank erosion and the risk of flooding. The concept of transition risk encompasses the uncertain financial impacts, positive and negative, that result from the effects of the implementation of a low-carbon economic model on economic actors. AFD's country risk team is currently developing a methodology to integrate the macroeconomic impact of the low-carbon transition. The approach adopted consists firstly of measuring the exposure of countries. To do this, it is necessary to be able to identify the industries that will be affected by the low-carbon transition, known as declining sectors or industries. Once the declining sectors have been identified, it will be necessary to assess their weight and the effects of these declining sectors on the economy as a whole. The analysis will aim to assess the impact of a low-carbon transition on macroeconomic and socioeconomic aggregates. For example, the ability of declining industries to generate foreign exchange will be measured by the weight of these industries in the country's foreign trade. Similarly, depending on the composition of fiscal revenues and expenditures, the low-carbon transition could significantly penalize a country's public finances. For example, countries with high tax revenues from declining industries. In conclusion, climate risk analysis has become essential for financial institutions in their assessment of the resilience of the economies of the countries in which they operate. It is also essential for public decision-makers, particularly in order to guide public action in a world faced with climate change. A detailed analysis of the exposure of a country's economy to climate hazards and of its vulnerabilities makes it possible to identify the country's weaknesses, but also relevant adaptation strategies to ultimately strengthen the resilience of the country and its economy.